fully virtual concurrent session at ICA 2023. My name is Jessica Lilly and I'll be chairing today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians of the lands on which we meet today, both in Australia and around the world, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd like to extend that respect and acknowledgement to any First Nations people listening today. So we only have one presentation in this session, but it's a really interesting one on lessons learned for future pandemic preparedness and the work of the IAA's Pandemic Task Force. Our presenters today are Sara Teppema and Stuart Wason. Sara is based in the US and is a strategic healthcare leader, consultant, actuary, researcher, mentor, analyst, and self-proclaimed public health geek. I love that. Whose career has spanned over 30 years. She is also a member of the Society of Actuaries Board of Directors and is on its executive leadership team. Stuart is a semi-retired Canadian actuary with extensive experience across Canadian and international insurance issues. And he has also held leadership roles across a number of international organizations, including with the IAA. Welcome, Sara and Stuart.
Thanks, Jessica. Great to be here today. Thank you for your nice introduction. And we're excited to talk today about an IAA task force, the Pandemics Task Force. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our task force and then talk a little bit about our first output from that task force, a paper that we are currently working on, and we'll get into that a little bit more. So I'm just going to jump into our slides. We've called this session Lessons Learned because that is the title of our first paper. What we wanted to do was focus on what have we learned from not just COVID, mostly COVID, but not just COVID, and the pandemic response to COVID, and what can we learn from that to take for future pandemics. Hopefully we'll never need to know, but there's a good chance we will. So we want to make sure we think about how actuaries can be responsive and assist governments and businesses and others in responding to future pandemics. So our overview, I think I said this, but we're going to talk a little bit about our task force so everyone's aware. And then some of our upcoming activities that we have on our work plan. And then finally, we'll do a deep dive into our paper and what we've learned from that paper so far. So the task force kicked off last summer, and we have had some shifts around in leadership, and we got going full force the end of last year, end of 2022. The task force is a finite committee, so we plan for it to sunset at the end of 2024. And in that time, we have some ambitious plans, and we hope to get a lot of output out of this that we can share with member associations and with actuaries around the world. Our members are from 5 continents and 9 countries, and the countries are listed here, but we've got members from Australia, Canada, India, Japan, Netherlands, Lebanon, South Africa, the UK, and the United States. It's a pretty great group, and I'm really excited to chair this group and get to spend time with them every month. This is a summary of our work plan, and here are some. So we've completed one big task, which was we're calling it a repository. But one of the things we decided we needed to do was we knew that a lot of organizations and actuaries and businesses all around the world have done a lot of work modeling and papers and committees and different responses to the pandemic. And we wanted to make sure we captured that in a single place to make sure that we were acknowledging all the work that's been done and trying not to duplicate efforts, but instead pick up from where everyone else has left off and try to pull learnings out of that so that we could carry them forward. And so basically what we have is a table full of links to papers and websites and organizations and other groups that have done a lot of really great work. So that is complete. And we thought about making that something that we tried to maintain, but it is really hard work to maintain a list of papers like that, because it's always changing. Links break. But anyway, if anyone is interested, we'd be happy to share that repository with anyone. And it would be kind of closed down as of February 2023. Our next big activity is this lessons learned paper. We'll talk about that in a little bit. The third activity that we're working on right now is a podcast. And this first podcast will be on data and modeling. There's so much to talk about in terms of data and modeling, which we've learned as we've been, collecting all of these repository resources and talking to actuaries and looking at the work from FMAs or actuarial organizations around the world. And so because there's so much to say, we'll probably do a number of podcasts on data and modeling, but one of the first ones will be with an individual. The nice thing about podcasts is it lets people share what they're doing, and it's not a ton of work for them. There's a little bit of preparation, but we don't have to do a webcast. It's just two people talking, you record the session, and it's generally good to go. So we're pretty excited about that. I don't know, there's been some podcasts from the IAA, but not that many. So we're hoping that this is kind of a tradition that we start and continue. Another area that we want to do is there are a number of IAA committees. All of them have been talking about the pandemic in some fashion or another. So what we wanted to try to do is make sure we get everybody together to talk through and make sure we're not duplicating effort, make sure we're all collaborating, and hopefully that collaboration will generate new ideas and original ideas that are new and different. And then the next issue here is discussion with supranationals. So the IAA maintains relationships with a number of non-actuarial organizations. For example, the OECD, World Health Organization, the IAIS, and several other organizations. And, those organizations rely on the IAA and other actuarial organizations for a number of, actuarial specific type of advice and expertise. And so they've asked us for some information, especially related to protection gaps and coverage gaps. And so what we want to make sure is that we are we're opening discussions with them about pandemic response and preparing for future pandemics. And we're hoping that this first paper that we are writing right now will be a way to have those conversations. And then we'll also be hopefully meeting with them to talk about specific requests that they might have. The IAA has a number of people identified as liaisons to those organizations, and they are already aware of our paper and the work we're doing. So they'll know to bring any output that we have when they have discussions with those organizations. And then we have a number of other papers planned for the rest of the year. I'm going to go ahead and jump to that. So some of our content that we plan for the rest of the year. The first one is, and I mentioned this earlier, but protection gaps and coverage gaps. So specifically related to the supranational requests, but there may be other organizations that have requests that we work with. We will talk about things like future insurability, guaranteed insurability of health insurance, potentially business interruption insurance, but so it's not confined to one particular practice area. It really spans all practice areas. The next topic is data and modeling. Again, there's so much to say about this, and there's so many different angles. The first paper, we're hoping to take more of an educational perspective. So, there'd be challenges of different approaches, and there's a lot of issues related to consistency of data. Different countries reported things differently. We'll talk a bit more about that too in a few minutes. But like I said, there's a lot to say. So we want to make sure that this is something that we will be helpful to actuaries around the world as they're thinking about modeling in the future. We could dwell on the past and all the things that went wrong, or we could focus on the future and really think about what can we do to be better about modeling? What can we do to assist in making better data in the future? How do we deal with data that's not very good? Because we know that it will not very good in the future. The third topic for our papers would be regulatory and financial institution preparedness. Fourth is pensions and social security systems and how those can be resilient and prepared for future pandemics. And then some other topics that we've brought up that I think are interesting. I think this first one is covered, but the second bullet here is the future role of actuaries as risk experts, not just in insurance, but in many other facets, because, pandemics introduce a lot of different new kinds of risks. There's also an interaction with climate risk that I know Stuart is very, very keen on. He's part of the IAA's climate risk task force, and there's been a lot of activity with that group. And there's a surprising amount of intersection between pandemics and climate risk. And then finally, there's a topic that's particularly near and dear to my heart, which is inequities. I work a lot with health equity in the US, and I think there's a lot we can talk about in terms of inequities, whether it's with vaccines or treatment or other ways that there's an equitable, response to the pandemic. So I'm going to jump into our paper. I'm going to turn it over to Stuart to cover. We have 5 lessons that have come out of this paper, and they're really kind of broken into themes. So we've got 5 themes that we're going to cover in the next few slides. And Stuart's going to talk about the first one.
Okay.
Oh, first of all, sorry. Maybe I'll, sorry, Stuart, I didn't mean to jump the gun, but I'll give a little bit of overview of this paper. I forgot we had these slides in here. Apologies. So the goal of this paper was a short overview paper, and we will be talking about pandemics, not just COVID, but HIV, AIDS, leveraging the existing work from actuaries and others. And then the objectives were to take stock of where we are as the pandemic comes to somewhat of an official close, although we know it's not over at all. We want to make sure that actuaries have advice and direction in terms of, we talk about this, but in terms of future pandemics. We also want to showcase to other organizations what actuarial organizations can do and have done. And in terms of, data analysis and modeling, but also as risk experts, also as, insurance and coverage experts, and how we can assist governments and organizations. And then we want to respond to the requests from OECD and IAIS and other supranationals. And then finally, we want to provide an overview of best and worst practices for collecting data and reporting data. Again, more to help in future planning and less to dwell on the past. And then the outline of our paper is going to have a whole section on modeling and data. And then there's practice area specific issues. Practice areas being life and mortality, pensions, healthcare, general insurance, and P&C. And then finally, enterprise risk management. And then we have some broader economic and societal impacts, including financial sector resilience, and then intersection with other issues. And those will come through in the themes that we talk about now. And sorry, Stuart, I didn't mean to jump the gun, but I'll let you take over in this first slide.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Sara, and good day to you all. It will come as no surprise if you were counting the number of times that Sara in her opening remarks referred to data and modeling as being big issues. It should be no surprise that lesson 1 for you is all about data. Actuaries, of course, are accustomed to making sense of disparate data, but the pandemic has really thrown us a number of curves and taught us a number of lessons. There have been a number of actuarial associations who've been playing a very key role, important role in trying to understand, dissect the data anomalies that have existed due to the pandemic. Just very, very simply, reporting systems can differ by country, but also the way in which each country has responded to the pandemic has varied considerably. Whether it's the public health measures they have implemented, what segments of the population they've targeted with those measures. Vaccines, how were they rolled out? Were they even available by jurisdiction? These have all also had a big impact on the trajectory of the pandemic and play themselves out through data. But we know through watching the TV on a regular basis during the pandemic that public health officials and our elected leaders were challenged to get enough and good data, good enough data, so that they could make the important decisions to keep us as safe as possible during the course of the pandemic. So this all boils down to lesson one. It's all about data. And just some side points that maybe aren't on this slide. In dealing with data during a pandemic, we don't have the luxury of time. We don't have lots and lots of time to analyze. We're going to have incomplete data. We're going to have to work with other professionals in the field who are dealing with this particular pandemic. So that just a couple of tidbits that will be in the report. And as Sara said, we're not trying to cover the landscape on this topic, because there'll be other papers that will need to dive deeper, but this is just a start. Okay, lesson 2, back to you, Sara.
I'm trying to mute to make sure any background noise is minimized. But anyway, so lesson 2, collaboration and communication. One of the things that came out in the paper, and by the way, we had multiple authors contributing to this paper. Each section had an author and at least one author and at least one reviewer. And the thing that came out in just about every section, regardless of who the author was and what the topic was, is that it was really necessary, and it is always necessary, for us to collaborate with other professionals. And we would like for them to rely on us, but we also need to make sure that we are appropriately relying on their expertise when needed. And so, when we're communicating, there's a lot. There's 1 + 1 = 3. There's a lot of synergies that can be gained. One other interesting thing was that there are groups of actuaries that effectively use social media during COVID-19. So, for example, in the UK, the COVID-19 Actuaries Response Group was really on top of it and was able to put out great information for people on a very consistent basis using social media. And so that's a way that actuaries can get the message out. And then finally, because we tend to be very objective and data driven, we can help to weed through. There's two new words. Well, two. I guess there's new-ish words. There's misinformation and there's disinformation. Misinformation. There was a lot of misinformation. Things were moving very quickly. Misinformation is sort of the accidental, not intentional. There was a lot of things that were not known, and things happen fast. Disinformation is sort of that intentional, abuse, using the situation to put out information that's just not right and is not helpful to most. And so, as actuaries and data people, we can really help to differentiate between misinformation and disinformation, and just truth, and science. And to the extent that science can change, we can help convey that message as well. As we were having a discussion a few days ago in Sydney, we had a great conversation about communication and actuarial communications, and we felt like that actually might be a good paper. So among the topics, in addition to the topics we talked about earlier, communication may be one that we decide to take on, because there's so many opportunities to talk about actuarial communication in this environment of a pandemic. I'm going to move on to lesson 3. And this is kind of related. So professional practice, and Stuart also alluded to this, is very fast pace. And when there's a crisis, we have to react potentially faster than we're comfortable doing. As actuaries, we like to take our time and cross all the T's and dot all the I's and make sure that we are thoroughly doing our work. But sometimes in a pandemic, we're going to have to move more quickly. And then the other thing in terms of professional practice, again, we've talked about this already, but data quality can be very poor. And we have to use what we have in the best way that we can. The other thing you have to understand is that past experience is not reliable for future models. So if you're building a model, you need to be careful about what data you are using to train that model. And you need to be making sure that you are accounting for scenarios and different types of data and possible ways that your model can fail because you are looking at the past and not the future. Finally, the question at the bottom is, do our professional standards as currently written enable us to contribute to the response? And the thing that we talked about a few days ago, and I think that is the message that I've gotten, is our professional standards actually held up pretty well during the pandemic. There is enough give and take in terms of the need for a fast pace, but also the need to be thorough. And I think, it was a bit of a test of our standards that in this crisis, were they able to hold up and still produce high quality and excellent results? And I think pretty much around the world, the answer was yes. Lesson 4 is about healthcare systems. And I happen to be in health practice, and I work a lot with healthcare delivery in the US. But, this is really about the healthcare system very broadly, public health systems and also delivery systems. The need that these systems must be shored up in order to support a health crisis like a pandemic. Public health interventions really did help. And the other thing that we learned was that the healthcare infrastructure in terms of healthcare delivery, healthcare providers, hospitals, and physicians were very, very strained. And so one of the opportunities for actuaries is to bring in, enterprise risk management practices and to help those organizations. That many of them already do this, but either governments or private organizations could really benefit from actuarial risk expertise. And so, again, scenario testing and planning for the future. And then I'm going to turn the last lesson over back to Stuart.
I'm looking at the clock on the wall there. It shortens up my time frame, but Jessica, do I have a minute or so to just cover this slide?
Absolutely. Take any time.
Oh, great. So lesson 5 is just more broadly on risk management. What should we be learning as a result of the pandemic? And of course, I think we've all experienced the ramifications of the pandemic, some of the unforeseen things we would not have thought about in advance, tipping points, things like we were working from home by necessity. And we found ways of doing it, just like we're doing with this particular presentation today. It's been a jump shift, hasn't it, for many of us? So the pandemic has caused quite a few feedback loops, tipping points on within our society and even our economy. Frequently mentioned are the supply chain implications. Prior to the pandemic, we relied on just-in-time delivery of so many goods. But with the pandemic, that got totally disrupted, and supply chain needed to be repaired subsequent to the pandemic. So anyone who deals with risk, a risk such as the pandemic, needs to be prepared to deal with threat multipliers, risks that interact and make other risks worse. So we may get into this a little bit more in a moment in our Q&A session. Thank you very much for your attention.
And that's the end of our slide presentation. So I don't know, I think we can turn it over for Q&A now. I'll stop sharing and we'll have.
Thank you very much. Thank you both for that fantastic presentation. And I'll remind audience members that they can ask any questions either through in the app using the Now On function, or in the chat. I've got that up as well. So I might start with you, Stuart, if that's okay, as one of the paper's authors. Do you have any comments on the key lessons and their importance to the work of actuaries?
Well, thanks, Jessica. Yeah, it's been fun working with all the authors, and as we put the paper together and trying to figure out what our key messages are. But the area of the paper that I've been trying to contribute to is on the topic of broader societal and economic impact of the pandemic. Pandemics in general, not just this one, disrupt the everyday lives of people, both to their work and their non-work activities. In turn, such disruption affects commerce, productivity, employment, travel, leisure, and other activities. In our modern, crowded, and highly interconnected world, COVID-19 has resulted in broad economic and societal impacts, in addition to its direct impact on mortality and morbidity. Pandemics prior to COVID-19 likely also produced broader economic and societal impact beyond the direct impact on mortality and morbidity. Absences from work, reduced productivity, reduced socialization, and a reduction in economic activity were likely also outcomes of prior pandemics. However, COVID-19 has distinguished itself from these previous pandemics due to the environment in which it has spread. First of all, its speed of transmission. It spread around the globe within weeks of its outbreak in China, thanks to air travel, the volume of global passenger traffic, and the ease of airborne transmission between people. Secondly, speed of communication. News of COVID-19 was passed to all corners of the globe on a minute-by-minute basis, thanks to the internet. Speedy communication enabled timely health measures to be introduced, but it also triggered mass changes in population behavior within days or weeks of COVID-19 and its news. And then thirdly, our world is increasingly crowded, complex, and very interconnected. For example, the global population grew from 1.9 billion in 1918 to 7.7 billion in 2019. In the same period, global GDP grew from $5 to $88 trillion. In 2019, our world revolved around global trade and the concept of just-in-time supply chain delivery. COVID-19 caused massive disruption to both trade and commerce. As a result, COVID-19 resulted in a much wider and more diverse set of societal and economic consequences than we might have expected. Indeed, the tail of outcomes was very much fatter than we would have expected. Actuaries have an important role in advising clients and the public on the risks posed by pandemics, including consequential ripple effects, tipping points, such as those evidenced by COVID-19's broader economic and societal impact. As we just noted a minute ago in lesson 5, there are implications here for broader risk management, and that there are interactions between a pandemic and other risk events. These can lead to feedback loops and tipping points. These need to be carefully watched, modeled, scenarios built, etc. Anyone who deals with risk needs to be prepared for the threat multipliers. We talked about that in lesson 5. I would suggest that these implications extend beyond the consideration of pandemic risk itself, as they may also have application when considering other types of risk, such as climate-related risks. The repercussions of fatter tails, more catastrophic losses, will lead to heightened interest by supervisors and governments in the sharing of losses amongst stakeholders, and the role of insurance and finance sectors in providing resilience. Thanks very much, Jessica.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And we've had a couple of other questions come through online too. So question for both of you: to what extent have regulators introduced or amended their prudential provisions requirements for life insurers against the adverse financial impact from pandemics?
Well, I think that probably that question could be answered many, many ways, depending on the jurisdiction and the country. So I don't know if we can even start to, apologies, I don't know if we could even start to answer that question unless, Stuart, you have some thoughts about that. But I mean, I can probably speak to the US perspective, but I think it's probably different around the world. I don't know, Stuart, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, just are the supranational bodies that you mentioned earlier, Sarah, very much on the top of our mind, and they've done a number of papers and studies on the protection gap topic, and that did come up because of particular product type, especially that occurred in the pandemic. And so it's certainly our expectation, our desire to make sure we address those issues.
Yeah, and that's the paper that I think the next paper that we're going to work on is about coverage gaps, and it's of really specific interest to regulators, IAIS supervisors, that sort of thing. So definitely it'll be in that paper.
Wonderful, thank you. And another fantastic question that's come through: how do we make sure these lessons learned remain relevant and are remembered for the next large pandemic, which could be many years in the future?
That is such a great question. Yeah, well, hopefully, we'll have a nice body of work that is well organized, and we've communicated it well to our principals and our partners. But I think that's part of the job of actuaries is to make sure that we are always thinking about not just pandemic risk, but really, any kind of catastrophic risk or any risk. And so I think, in our lifetimes, all of us will remember this time. And likely we will be considering it if we do scenario modeling, for example. And I would sort of argue that we need to think need to think beyond this pandemic and remember. We need to remember it and then think beyond it to say, well, what are we not thinking about? What are some, maybe watching the research, watching sort of that edge case, studies or edge, or kind of, I think someone mentioned, talk to the crazy people. So it's the people who are thinking about the really interesting scenarios and the really interesting potential catastrophes or potential risks. The people who have their pet thing that they're worried about, pay attention, and because that could be the next crisis, and that's the next thing that actuaries need to worry about. So I would argue that it's not just pandemics that we need to remember, but also beyond that, think about what could potentially happen next.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking of, that the implications here of what you were just of the question are excellent, because so many crises, financial crises, I'm perhaps thinking about, do come up quite suddenly. And actuaries have a key role in providing advice to decision makers to help them answer the question, well, what should I do next? How should I react? How do I reduce my risk? Is there an opportunity here as well? And we won't have the luxury in these types of crises in taking our time, putting everything together, but nevertheless, other parties, stakeholders, will be relying on us to give information to help them decide what they should do next as the crisis begins to develop.
Absolutely. Yeah, the comment that really stood out for me is the data quality can be poor and inconsistent, but we must use what we have or risk irrelevance. That sort of thoroughness versus timeliness question.
Right.
It's really good. So I'm just checking the chat. I think I might end with one more question for you, Sarah, just around is there a way for other actuaries to get involved in the task force?
Oh, great. Well, so yes, we'll be putting out content, we'll be writing additional papers. And we don't, those papers are written. It so happens that Stuart is an author for this paper, but we are hoping to gather experts from all over the world for each paper that we write. And if there's a particular area that you're interested in and you'd like to contribute to a paper, please reach out to us. You can do it through the IAA or hopefully my contact information is somewhere on the app. I think it probably is. And let us know that you're interested, and we will, and in what area you're interested in contributing. And we would be thrilled to have others on this, working with us on this.
Wonderful. Thank you both very much for your time today. Thank you to the audience for listening in, and all the best for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.